Okay, so, okay. I'm very sorry to do that, but we do have to keep to time. And so the next speaker is Steve Stearns, whose focus has been the evolution of life history, and especially human life history. And he literally is somebody who doesn't need any introduction. Steve.
You just turned it off. Okay, great. Okay, what I'm going to do today is show you how I selected my topic from the course in evolutionary medicine that I teach. I'd like to first make you aware that there are a couple of general background pieces of information. There's this book. Wanda has another one. There are a couple of books out on evolutionary medicine. This one is 2008. She also has a new edition. You can go to this URL and you can look at any of 12 talks that were given at Yale earlier this year on evolutionary medicine. They are streaming digital video, and if you have any trouble getting it or downloading it, just send me an email, stephen.stearns@yale.edu, and I'll tell you what software you need to download to get to it. Now, the range of issues in evolutionary medicine is pretty big. I could talk about traces of our evolutionary history. I could go into reproductive medicine, and I could give you the evolutionary hypothesis for preeclampsia that Kurt didn't mention, or the evolutionary hypothesis for twinning that he didn't mention. I could talk about, at great length, about the ecology and evolution of infectious disease. There's a huge literature on that. I could go into evolutionary genetics, genomics, and emergence of diseases, where we use phylogenetic methods to trace where HIV came from, that kind of thing. I could talk about the evolutionary biology of degenerative disease. Each one of the subtitles is an hour minimum, okay? Now, if you're faced with that, and by the way, some of these are what our Pleistocene ancestry was like, some of them are what our pathogens are like, and some of them is what happens when we get older. When you're faced with that, you have to make decisions, right? So I could either choose an important classic theme, I could give you a surprising new insight, I could give you an overarching general message, I could do stuff I've worked on myself, right? That's the usual out. Then I just pull out my research slide. Or I could give you practical applications in the clinic and in public health. And what I decided was to give you a surprising new insight. Okay? I've just got time for one. I'm limited to 18 minutes. So this is the hygiene old friends hypothesis. This is about a mismatch to modernity, and it's about why humans are different because they're clean. Okay? Our non-human primates are not especially clean. I don't know if you've snuggled up to one recently, but they're not especially clean. Okay, this is the hypothesis. Our immune responses evolved on the presupposition that we were infected by worms, and we had a pretty interesting and complicated gut flora, and we had probably other commensals in other parts of our bodies. When hygiene and antibiotics took these things out, our immune systems reacted inappropriately. We notice that autoimmune diseases are increasing. And in fact, as the epidemics of infectious disease have decreased in the 20th century, an epidemic of autoimmune disease has started to occur. This is just an example. This is the decrease in trichinosis, which is a worm transmitted from eating uncooked pork. And the epidemic of autoimmune disease has started to result in books. So you know it's starting to get financially rewarding. There are both temporal and spatial correlates of this. What you see here in yellow is where there's a lot of type 1 diabetes, and what you see in red is where there are a lot of parasitic worms. And you do not tend to find autoimmune diseases in the tropics. Basically, that's what that tells you. This is a country-by-country correlation of diabetes, type 1 diabetes, and the incidence of tuberculosis, and they are negatively associated. Those are correlations. That's not causation. Now, evidence is accumulating on links between worms, allergies, and asthma. This is some of it. It's been known for some time that farm children have fewer allergies than city children. There are good studies that showing Gabonese kids with schistosomiasis have fewer allergic reactions to dust mites. There are studies in Ethiopia, Brazil, Venezuela, and in Gambia that adults infected with nematodes have less asthma. And when we think about that, you want to have some kind of understanding about how the coevolutionary history of worms and humans might lead to this sort of inappropriate reaction now. Well, particularly worms, which must infect our bodies for quite a while to have reproductive success, we're under considerable selection to manipulate our immune system to allow them to stay in our body. So they produce molecules that are blocking immune responses that would kill or expel them. Those happen to be in the signaling pathways that elicit allergies and asthma. Our immune system then had to adapt in a way to the long-term presence of worms, and it had to stop producing an inappropriate inflammatory response. I'm sure many of you know that a lot of the problems of disease are actually caused by the way our immune system responds to them, and inflammation is a serious problem. In this case, it's quite clear that our immune system down-regulated its inflammatory response if it had a chronic worm infection. Now, the point here is that both sides changed. Then one side got taken out. The purpose of this complicated diagram, and believe me, I could make it a lot more complicated by putting in all of the signaling pathways of the immune system, and therefore there will be an exam on it during the break, and you cannot get coffee unless you do it, is basically that the worms are modulating signaling which is dealing with the differentiation of the cell types that are producing the response. The purpose of putting this up here is also to indicate that if you go to some recent reviews by Ann Cook's group at the medical school in Cambridge University, that you can pick up a lot of background information on this if you're interested. So the purpose of the slide is not to really give you a lot of details, just to show you that some of the detail is known and it can be looked up. So the causes are pretty complex. We do have an epidemic of allergies and autoimmune disease. Part of it is due to the removal of parasites. Part of it's due to the inappropriate responses of our innate anti-worm machinery. By the way, some of that is in the innate immune system, some of it's in the adaptive immune system. And part of it is due to the inflammatory responses in our own tissues. And part of it is due to the fact that the screening mechanisms that we have in thyroid and spleen to filter out cells that might inappropriately react with our own body tissues is now dealing with a much, much larger flow of immune response to deal with, and it may be getting overwhelmed. So it's complicated, and how much is caused by each of these things is not yet known. We do know that you can treat animal models with worms and you can prevent autoimmune disease. So there is a mouse, which is a model for type 1 diabetes, and here is a list of all of the worm treatments which are effective in down-regulating or eliminating type 1 diabetes in that model system. And here are helminth infections or products that are preventing autoimmunity in other animal models. So the autoimmune diseases are autoimmune encephalomyelitis, Graves' thyroiditis, colitis, inflammatory bowel disease, things like that. Now, is it possible that it's good to be dirty? There are daycare centers in Europe that advertise that they have dirty rugs so that the kids crawling around on them will pick up worms. It really is probably much more complicated than that. It probably is not sufficient simply to be dirty. You have to pick up a specific kind of worm if you want to avoid autoimmune disease. These are some of the kinds of things that live in humans, and if you wanted to decide what the ideal characteristics are of a therapeutic helminth, basically you would want to pick one up that, if possible, wasn't going to damage us with its own worm infection, that didn't multiply in us, okay, so you could control it, it wouldn't get out of hand, and so forth. There's a list of stuff here, and it turns out that the best one looks like the pig whipworm, which will elicit reactions in humans without being able to live in humans very well. So, people have started doing therapy with the ova of pig whipworms. By the way, when I got into evolutionary medicine, I didn't hear about this hypothesis until about 3 or 4 years after I encountered evolutionary medicine in 1996. So I heard about it in about 1999, and I was just amazed. I didn't think this could possibly be true. When I asked Richard Flavelle, who's a Howard Hughes professor in immunobiology at Yale, what he thought was important in evolutionary medicine, he said worms. I couldn't believe it. You know, here's this, you know, guru of immunobiology, and this was what he knew about evolutionary medicine. It turns out, that's why I'm surprised. You know, this stuff really seems to work. So here's therapy with pig whipworm eggs. 4 patients with Crohn's disease and 3 that have ulcerative colitis improved after eating 2,500 embryonated ovi. 23 of 29 patients with Crohn's disease who received 2,500 ovi every 3 weeks for 24 weeks responded with a significant reduction of symptoms. Of 54 patients that had ulcerative colitis in a double-blind trial with placebos, 43% of those that got the worms improved, 17% of those on placebos. It's always nice to have somebody pay attention to you. So, to me, the most dramatic is this one. Worms do appear to reduce the impact of a very, very nasty autoimmune disease for which there was no known cure. There has been a case control study in Argentina showing that the progress of multiple sclerosis is much, much slower in patients infected with parasitic worms. And this evidence was convincing enough so that the NIH is now funding a clinical trial in Iowa in which MS patients are getting pig whipworms, and they are trying to stimulate the immune system the way that a worm would, but without causing a worm infection in these patients. So let me show you the data. This is the data from the Argentine study. What you have on the y-axis in all 4 panels is some measure of multiple sclerosis. In some cases it's brain scans, in some cases it's a doctor ticking off on a chart just how far they've progressed on a scale of intensity of the disease. The x-axis is basically from 0 to 5 years, okay, well, months down here. And what you can see, by the way, this is a case control study, so the people entering the study all had multiple sclerosis, but 12 of them had worms and 12 of them didn't have worms, and they were all natural worm infections. This is not therapy, this is actual natural worm infections. And what you see is that for all 4 measures, the progress of the disease, the intensity of it was dramatically faster in the patients that did not have worm infections. Okay, so the take-home points from this basically are that our immune system evolved on the assumption that we are reliably infected by worms. I grew up in Hawaii. I ran around barefoot in Hawaii. I had worms when I was a kid. And it's all that we also had a very complex gut flora. So that if we sterilize ourselves through excessive hygiene, our immune system can then react inappropriately and our digestive tract can respond unnaturally. So these are mismatches to modernity. This is just one example of many ways in which we are mismatched to modernity. There are bunches of others. For example, we as a species have not yet really adapted to having milk and alcohol in our diets. Those are both cultural innovations. We're still catching up on those fronts, and some people are still very seriously affected when they have milk or alcohol. There are probably other ways. I think Randy will probably tell you later that there are a lot of stresses of civilization that our psyche doesn't deal with very well. But this is a case in which there is a direct clinical medical application of an evolutionary insight that was surprising and gives some hope for people who otherwise might not have had hope. And for me, as an evolutionary biologist who didn't really get trained in medicine, it's remarkable to have that kind of emotional hit when you see that insights from a field with which you identify can actually help the suffering that someone like a multiple sclerosis patient would feel in their lives. So here's a case where an evolutionary insight, which basically is that our biology doesn't evolve as fast as our culture, and it keeps trying to catch up, is helping to develop an effective therapy for a disease that was previously untreatable. Thank you.